Today we're going to be talking about the sociology of ancient Greek philosophies. It's guided by Chapter 3 of Randall Collins' The Sociology of Philosophies, but I've added a substantial amount of additional research to supplement Collins' largely big-picture discussion with more detailed philosophical analyses about the contents of each philosopher's material. Remember Collins' law of small numbers. It's strictly a law about the number of knots of arguments within a field. This law is going to come up again and again as we read Collins, and it's without a doubt the most important takeaway from his theory. I'll quote Collins here. The number of active schools of thought which reproduce themselves for more than one or two generations in an argumentative community is on the order of 3 to 6. The law of small numbers doesn't just mean that the field of intellectual competition can't get too crowded. It also means that available slots for positions within the limited attention space do not go unfilled for long. A strong position that dominates the field, outcompeting other positions, soon subdivides into competing positions, filling the newly available slots. However, when this subdivision results in overcrowding, the weaker of the subpositions will either die out or become absorbed into positions which make it into the next generation. And so the number of major positions within the field remains stable across the generations on average, because the number of slots or the spaces available for the positions that may or may not come into existence remains stable. It's hard for us to imagine just how narrowly the law of small numbers constrains the field. We're used to the classical picture of philosophy as depicted in the works like the School of Athens. More great philosophers than you can keep track of, all gathered together in the agora and engaged in endless discourse. Knowing that most of the philosophers depicted here were not contemporaries doesn't seem to help very much to correct this mental image. Collins' picture is different. Thanks to the law of small numbers, each generation only gets about 2 to 3 major philosophers, if that. Here, we'll explore the dynamics of the limited attention space through 2 exemplary, interconnected lineages of pre-Socratic philosophers. Beginning with Thales, these were the very first of the Greek philosophers. I want to emphasize what a spectacular event in the history of the Greek peoples this was. The fact that these thinkers were literally inventing philosophy. But invent philosophy from scratch, they did not. The first Greek philosophers inherited the bounties of both their own pre-philosophical tradition as well as those of older civilizations, namely the ancient Egyptians, whom they admired for their wisdom. Here's Eresh, writing 600 years before the first Greek philosophers, and more than 800 years before Plato and Socrates. Quote, "Man perishes, his corpse turns to dust, all his relatives return to the earth, but writings make him remembered in the mouth of the reader. A book is more effective than a well-built house or a tomb chapel, better than an established villa, or a stela in the temple. They gave themselves a book as their lector priest, a writing board as their dutiful son. Teachings are their mausolea, the reed pen their child, the burnishing stone their wife. Both great and small are given them as their children, for the writer is chief." End quote. Many signs of philosophy in the Collinsian sense here are already present. The written word as the sacred object, a self-conscious promotion of an alternative system of values, which puts intellectual acclaim above the rewards localized to the single generation, the survival of texts across the generations in the mouth of the reader. Consider these forms in which complex thought often took place in the pre-philosophical ancient world. Of these, mythology is the oldest. Every culture in the world was once mythopoeic. Some indigenous peoples in isolation might still be mythopoeic to this day. It could be said that the rise of philosophy is the transition from the mythopoeic world into the rational world. You can imagine each transitional form emerging in response to the previous forms, such as the satire becoming possible only in a culture with epic poems that could be satirized. Of these, only mythology and history could be said to be restricted in their subject matter. Mythology stands out as also being restricted in the degree to which it may be philosophical, in the sense of detached, abstract thought. What is myth? Mr. and Mrs. Frankfurt explain, quote, "Myth is a form of poetry, which transcends poetry in that it proclaims a truth, a form of reasoning, which transcends reasoning in that it wants to bring about the truth that it proclaims, a form of action, of ritual behavior, which does not find its fulfillment in the act, but must proclaim and elaborate a poetic form of truth." End quote. Let's return to the significance of the invention of philosophy. How does philosophy differ from other forms of complex and systematic thought, like mythological explanations for natural phenomena? Is not all human thought potentially philosophical? After all, even children are capable of philosophically pregnant questions. Some non-human animals can understand abstract concepts like zero, analogize between objects and relationships, or use tools. Philosophy was invented independently across the world many times over. At least the raw ingredients for philosophy seem to be intrinsic to complex thought and find profound expression in mythology. What differentiates mythology from philosophy? The mythopoeic mind, unfettered by undisciplined truth-seeking, does not distinguish between the natural world and the man-made world. The scientific mind sees the world primarily as an it, to be discovered. The mythopoeic mind sees it as a thou. Truth is not discovered by an observer or a thinker, but revealed by this thou to human participants in a reciprocal relationship. Hence, the specific form and imagery of myths are not arbitrary. As with allegories, although mythology is the product of fantasy, it differs from mere stories in its aspiration towards authoritative knowledge. In giving up this aspiration, mythologies become legend, saga, fable, fairy tale. Stories, even histories, become mythologized when it takes on the combination of fantasy and authority. Before philosophy, ancient Greece was mythopoeic. External conditions around 600 BCE began to shift the material base. The democratic revolution, successive political reforms, the spread of literacy. All of these external factors culminated to undermine religious cults and the traditional political life connected to them. It's not that ideas reduced to their surrounding material or even social conditions. Major changes on the material level set off periods of major change in the ideal level. Internally, the intellectuals navigate the demands of sociological laws, like the law of small numbers, through their splits and alliances. Externally, they negotiate the changes in the material base of political and economic changes through realignments. New spaces of argumentation had opened up. This shift was initially reflected in poetry. Whereas nature was once carved into categories corresponding to the anthropomorphic deities, both fickle and unfathomable, the newly proto-philosophical poets began incorporating order into the understanding of the deities themselves. The initial motion away from myth was made by the poets, such as Alcman and Hesiod, who unified the deities belonging to disparate religious myths into a genealogy. Subsequent intellectuals further distanced themselves from myths by writing critiques and interpretations of myths instead of poems. The great breakthrough came when Thales made the first move into philosophy by completely inverting the relation between gods and nature. All things are full of gods. They are the very substance making up nature, not to be understood anthropomorphically at all. The beginnings of Greek philosophy are thus counter-mythological. Much attention is given to just what constitutes nature. By late 500 BCE, the field is divided into several contending positions. The old gods, occupying the far right, the Pythagoreans, arguing for quasi-materialist concepts of numbers, occupying the center, and the physicalists such as Thales, arguing for elements, occupying the far left. Roughly speaking, the Milesians were philosophers who conceived of the world as being made up of some particular ingredient. This line of philosophers, going from Thales to Anaximander to Anaximenes, were, one, Thales, famously conceiving of the world as being made up of water. Anaximander conceiving of the world as being made of not any elements such as water, air, fire, or earth, but of primordial potential known as the boundless, and Anaximenes conceiving of the world as being made up of air. Let's return to the three lineages, the two major ones and the third, which we're going to look at separately in relation to the later generations. These three lineages originate respectively from Thales, Phrasides, and Xenophanes. Thales is the only philosopher among the 10 sages revered for their wisdom by the ancients. His program of seeking a physical element that explains both the origins and the constitution of the universe dominates the field for the next century. His theory of water as the organizing principle of the universe is a radically materialist break away from the mythological view of the world, even as he couches it in terms of gods and the soul. Anaximander succeeded Thales, becoming the second master of the school. He intensified the focus of the network on the question of the origins of the universe and emphasized the analogy between society and nature. He argued that nature has laws akin to the laws of society. However, the mythological influence remained in the form of his explanation that the laws of nature were a matter of justice, the violation of which was punished by offending matter being destroyed. His thesis that the boundless or the infinite was the originating and constitutive material of the universe was an advancement into a higher level of abstraction, anticipating the moves to be made by Parmenides and Heraclitus a century later. Interestingly, he also produced a map of the world. Anaximenes returned to a physical element, namely air, as the originating principle, may seem like a regression from Anaximander's abstraction of Thales' water into potential, but it was progress in the form of a reconciliation between Thales and Anaximander. Taking on Anaximander's critique of Thales, namely that a singular element like water could not possibly account for the variety of phenomena in the universe, but also accounting for the need for a more observable and less ambiguous entity than the boundless, Anaximenes proposes air as the simultaneously indeterminate and material building block of the universe. According to Anaximenes, air can condense into denser matter such as water or earth, or disperse into more volatile matter such as fire and lightning, depending on its temperature. Thus, he also furnishes the beginnings of a scientific, mechanical explanation of the elements. Heraclitus is not part of the Milesians. Miletus was destroyed in the Persian invasion of 494 BCE, destroying the Milesian school itself after Anaximenes. Nonetheless, Heraclitus is a part of its extended lineage, both by way of personal connections and by way of philosophical influences. We will revisit him shortly in more detail, as he is central to the most exciting moment in pre-Socratic philosophy. Fascinatingly, the personal connection between Anaximenes and Heraclitus is Hecataeus of Miletus, who, like Anaximander, also produced a world map. He is commonly referred to as the father of geography, and believed that the world was surrounded by a ring of water. It is a more realistic picture of the world compared to Thales or Anaximenes, in which the world is a disk floating on water or air respectively. You can see Miletus at the center of this map, not too far from Athens and Egypt. The geographical proximity of the philosophers ensured that their networks were dense with connections and activity. Another lineage begins with Xenophon. He was a critic of Homer, particularly regarding his characterization of the gods. Xenophon attacked anthropomorphic portrayals of gods, pointing out that if horses and oxen had hands and could draw, their gods would resemble horses and oxen. You see his point here. Humans made the gods resemble humans because humans can think only in terms of humans. He also intensified the movement away from polytheism, focusing on the idea of the greatest god amongst all gods. We can consider this progression towards monotheism as a predecessor to Plato's theory of the chief good, which provides the criterion of perfection for all other ideal forms. Parmenides was taught by Xenophon as well as by a student of Pythagoras. However, the Milesian influence is stronger in his work, and he seems to be reacting against the Pythagorean metaphysics that describes a world made up of numerous parts. His own metaphysics is that of a singular, unified being, and influenced the post-Parmenidean pluralists and atomists, namely Empedocles, Anaxagoras, Leucippus, and Democritus, who advocated for a multiplicity of unified entities that make up the world. We'll examine Parmenides in much more detail alongside Heraclitus in just a moment. We may now return to the School of Athens with a more grounded perspective. Here's Anaximander. Anaximander was Thales' star pupil, and taught both Pythagoras and Anaximenes. His originative principle that both explains the origins and the constitution of the universe is the boundless, which is an eternal and indeterminate source of all temporary and determinate physical phenomena. This is the single fragment of Anaximander's writing that remains to this day. Quote, "Whence things have their origin, thence also their destruction happens, according to necessity. For they give to each other justice and recompense for their injustice in conformity with the ordinance of time." End quote. Recall what we learned about the mythopoeic origins of proto-philosophy. The very first philosophers had to build upon the cultural capital of their predecessors, who were the wisdom tellers and the poets, still working within the logics of mythology. Anaximander himself wrote this philosophy in poetic form. Much of that mythopoeic origin remains in Anaximander's work. The ancient Greeks believed that, while the potential of each human being is infinite, their ambition is restricted by inherent human hubris, which is invariably punished by Dike, goddess of justice and moral order. Anaximander repurposes this mythopsychological theory to explain metaphysics. Physical phenomena arise out of the boundless through the disunity of the hitherto united potential. They return to their original boundless form over time, as the injustice of breaking free from the unity of their own potentiality is punished with decay. Pythagoras was a powerful influence on not only the pre-Socratics, but also the generations following on from Socrates, most important of whom was Plato. He believed in the transmigration of souls. Instead of being condemned for eternity to the dour monotony of the underworld, as the Greeks believed before him, the souls were reincarnated for all eternity. Eternity included the possibility of repetition, meaning that the same soul could eventually relive the same life once more. Although popularly claimed to have believed in everything being made up of numbers in the abstract Platonist sense in which we understand numbers, Pythagoras' conception of numbers was quasi-material, and at most proto-Platonic. Pythagorean numbers were in fact quasi-material in arithmetic, as in 3 apples, or 3 people, or 3 stacks of hay, and never 3 in and of itself. It was his followers who further developed their theory of numbers into a wholly idealist one. Plato's metaphysics was in no small part influenced by those Pythagoreans' increasingly more idealist theory of numbers. Heraclitus was not directly connected to the other philosophers as far as we know, but he was nonetheless deeply influenced by both the Milesians as well as Pythagoreans. His bold and poetic proclamations that all things are in perpetual flux is often misunderstood to mean that nothing remains consistent. You cannot step into the same river twice. But Heraclitus is really making a subtler point that is quite in line with the concerns of his immediate predecessors as well as his contemporaries, namely the question of the origin of and explanation for the universe. What Heraclitus is positing is that change, rather than being merely the difference between one state of some substance and another, is itself the organizing principle. A body of water can only ever be a river due to its flow. Hence, it is precisely change which allows a given river to remain as the same river. Parmenides was taught by Xenophonus and Ammianus, a Pythagorean philosopher. Xenophonus, in his satirical critique of the myths and his attempt to substitute for them a natural explanation of the physical world, ultimately began the enterprise of rational theology. Recall once again that movement away from mythopoeic thought and towards philosophical thought for the Greeks was towards increased abstraction, such as with Thales proclaiming that gods are in all things as a way to move away from the personal whims of anthropomorphic deities as the preeminent explanatory mechanism. Further advancing Xenophonus' radical tendencies in this direction, Parmenides moves the search for the elemental building blocks of the universe into a higher level of abstraction. Whereas the Milesians sought after the element constituting everything that exists, Parmenides is concerned with identifying the nature of existence itself. His organizing principle is all of true reality itself, which only appears to mortals as though it is changing from moment to moment. Parmenides contrasts true reality, knowable only through reason, with the apparent reality as known through the deceiving senses of the mortals. This is the blueprint inherited by Plato, expressed in his own division of the world into that of the perfect forms and that of the imperfect shadows of those forms. Recall Collins' exacting definition of the law of small numbers. The lower limit of the number of rival positions at any given creative period is at least 2, since opposition is crucial for creativity. Most creative periods usually have at least 3. There is also an upper limit. Anything above 4 to 6 positions gets whittled down between the generations. Existing thinkers of each generation will tend towards either filling niches left open or joining an incumbent alliance in some given niche. The rivalry between Parmenides and Heraclitus is a wonderful example of the law of small numbers, in which each thinker neatly fills their own niche, of extreme unity in the case of Parmenides, and extreme flux in the case of Heraclitus. Heraclitus represents the high point of elementalist thought, having brought the Milesian search for the elements into a higher level of abstraction. While his organizing principle is represented as fire, it is really change itself, for which fire is merely a metaphor. Here, he can be seen as the earliest of the Western process philosophers, for whom process rather than substances or essences are the preeminent object of philosophy, anticipating the likes of Whitehead, Hegel, Bergson, and even William James. Parmenides, on the other hand, is the most formidable anti-elementalist in history thus far, in arguing that what cannot be thought can no more exist. As well as the primacy of reason over the senses, Parmenides is Plato's foremost predecessor, as well as anticipating rationalist philosophers such as Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. His creativity emerges, above all, in the form of a reaction against elementalism as exemplified by Heraclitus, in whose elementalism of fire, all of the universe becomes an arena for perpetual strife. This idea, which so offended Parmenides that he invented an entire separate realm, thrilled Nietzsche to no end. Thus, the two striking and baffling caricatures of these two thinkers' positions as everything changes and nothing changes. With the previous discussion in mind, let's discuss the remainder of ancient Greek philosophy. From this point onward, the networks become much more complex, but the law of small numbers is still in action. During the final 3 generations of pre-Socratic philosophy, the factions had divided into 3 substantive movements in metaphysics and 1 primarily critical movement in epistemology. During this time, the Pythagoreans exerted their influence on the molten core of Greek philosophy. This was in spite of their secretive nature as a religious cult. Pythagorean thinkers such as Archytas, Echecrates, Simmias, and Cebes maintained ties with Socrates and Plato. Here, Echecrates is number 26, which you can spot just to the left of Socrates. Simmias is number 27, Cebes is 28. You can see them just above Echecrates. And they're all Pythagoreans. So, here you can see the Pythagorean Socratic Platonic cluster had a sizable presence. This posthumous influence is in no small part what has earned Pythagoras the status of a major philosopher in Collins' analysis. Like many major philosophers of the ancient era, Pythagoras had many works and ideas retroactively attributed to his name, as a way for future thinkers to piggyback off of his fame, even if sometimes they were forging works that they attributed to Pythagoras' name. So, the subsequent generations of Pythagoreans increasingly moved towards a concept of numbers as abstract and not material. Leucippus and Democritus, the 2 founding atomists, argued for a synthesis of Parmenidean permanence and Heraclitean flux. Their universe was composed of atoms which were unchanging in their composition, yet in flux in their coordination. This is very interesting, right? The 2 philosophers who were the greatest of rivals in the previous generations were reconciled in their thought by these atomists, who, at least according to, from their perspective, were satisfying the requirements of both Parmenides and Heraclitus in their theory. The third school, as introduced by Empedocles, features the theory of the 4 classical elements, namely air, fire, earth, and water, recombined through the 2 forces of love and strife. It was most influential above all amongst the medical theorists, whom we'll encounter later on, who repurposed his metaphysics into the famous physiological theory of the 4 humors. Collins points out the skeptics and the paradoxes as the 4th school, which is not a substantive school of thought, but rather parasitic on the other schools as a presence, taking on a plague on all houses strategy. This is best exemplified by Protagoras. He gives the first known instance of relativism and perspectivalism in Western philosophy in his thesis that man is the measure of all things. For this, Nietzsche judged Protagoras to be the principal precursor among the pre-Socratics to his own thought, as well as the premier defender of Heracliteanism. Zeno of Elea is infamous for having argued for the impossibility of motion, a bulldog to his teacher Parmenides in this way. Gorgias, who was probably taught by Empedocles, perversely argued for the non-existence of all things, along 3 lines. First, nothing exists. Second, even if something existed, it is incomprehensible anyway. Third, even if existence could be understood, knowledge of it could not be communicated to anyone else. This is an extreme opposition against Parmenidean being, as you can imagine, occurring along the three levels of metaphysics, epistemology, and rhetoric. However, Anaxagoras, just below Protagoras in the diagram, and his pupil Archelaus both return to the Talesian search for the elements, positing that infinite air was the organizing principle. We finally see Socrates at the center of the networks. He's a bottleneck connecting the previous generation to the subsequent generations. While academics frequently point out that the pre-Socratics are not all that much different from the post-Socratics and their practice of philosophy, sometimes even suggesting that the distinction is an arbitrary convenience, the networks make it clear that this is not the case in the sociological context. Observe how many of his network connections are conflictual. Although Socrates does not stand out for the originality of his philosophy, he secures his eminence through his network centrality. He thus survives throughout the generations as an emblem, carried by the successive members of organized schools. Now, if you look at all of the lines that are connecting Socrates to the predecessors and some of his contemporaries here, the fuzzy-looking lines are conflictual ties. So all of those ties are to his enemies. Very on brand for Socrates. So initially, the organized schools only existed as ritual brotherhoods. The first was the Pythagorean Brotherhood. This secret society had a material reality, owning buildings in several locations. It was an active force within politics as well, drawing both support and membership from the local aristocracy. The democratic rebellion of Magna Graecia around 450 BC burnt their buildings and caused the Pythagoreans to disperse, some to Tarentum and others to the Greek mainland. Within 50 years, they were out of politics, and within a century of its dispersal, the school had disappeared. Just after around 400 BCE, the philosophers discovered that they can deliberately create schools. At this point, the law of small numbers is being seriously violated. There's two older schools still operating, the Pythagoreans and the Abderans, and half a dozen more have rushed onto the scene. Two more lifestyle-based anti-school movements, not shown on the diagram, appear as well. The skeptics and the cynics. There is a gold rush in which school after school appears, largely modeled after the Pythagoreans. The consequent overcrowding of the attention space results in the culling of most of these 7 to 9 schools, leaving only 3 or 4 replacements by 300 BCE. The intense competition during this period leads to unexpected strategic innovations. For instance, Socrates' dialectic method, in which he engages other philosophers primarily through critique and disagreement, becomes radicalized into lifestyle movements. The philosophers of the lifestyle movements exemplify their own doctrines in dramatic ways that capture the imagination of the lay public. Diogenes is the most famous of all the lifestyle philosophers. Diogenes, originally raised in a wealthy family and well-educated, only turned to philosophy upon his exile. So he was exiled from his homeland of Sinop for committing fraud, in which he diluted coins with his father. The coins were made of precious, valuable metals, and he presumably melted them down and then recast them in the same shape using cheaper metals. His father oversaw the treasury, which allowed them to commit this fraud at a mass scale. Legend has it that he was told by an oracle of Delphi to devalue the currency, which he interpreted literally without understanding its metaphorical meaning, and committed this fraud as a consequence. Where the metaphorical meaning of the oracle was to critique and issue conventional materialistic values of society. Right. So the legend is untrustworthy. It's too neat. It was likely invented to lift moral blame from Diogenes. It has the telltale neatness and dramatic irony of a Greek tragedy about it. Even within Athens, Diogenes remained an outcast, though this time by doctrine. He was a student of Antisthenes, a pupil of Socrates, although Antisthenes rejected the practice of taking students. One of Antisthenes' contributions was to radicalize Socrates' dialectic method by making the opposition to other schools into a major part of his philosophical method. Diogenes inherited Antisthenes' slot in the intellectual field as ascetic and anti-conventionalist, thus becoming the intellectual's anti-intellectual. Yet, his philosophy overlapped most closely with the concerns of the lay public. So Diogenes is very interesting, right? So not only does his anti-philosophical stance paradoxically bring about his acclaim amongst the philosophers who are reacting against his anti-philosophical philosophy, also he has this beautiful mythological story about his origins as a philosopher, in which the very act of following the oracle's prophecy, which was a response, by the way, of him asking the oracle how to achieve success in life, led to what would have seemed to him as his downfall, which actually led to his success as a philosopher. The very fact that an intellectual's anti-intellectual, like Diogenes, could flourish signals the fact of overcrowding in the field. After all, a sophisticated and purely critical doctrine must necessarily be positioned within the context of more substantive doctrines in competition. Hence, we find in this period of overcrowding the likes of Antisthenes, his pupil Diogenes, and Diogenes' pupil Crates, all three of whom were ascetics and dramatically embodied their anti-conventionalist lifestyles. We also find there the extreme skeptic Pyrrho, who so despised indeterminacy as to refuse to choose between two diverging paths, and had to be guided around by his friends, because he would hurt himself otherwise whenever he came across a crossroads. He would just stand there, even say if a chariot was hurtling towards him, because he couldn't make up his mind about uncertain consequences. The networks of the formalized schools and the networks of personal connections superimpose onto one another. Look at the two diagrams here. These reinforce the general pattern onto each other. The networks of the schools and the networks of the personal connections between the philosophers. Here, we see the period of overcrowding as reflected both in the number of organized schools and the density of personal connections. At the end of the period of overcrowding, we see the law of small numbers in action once again. And so the end of the overcrowding period begins roughly with Arcesilaus, Chrysippus, and the ongoing generation of the Epicureans here. So the Epicureans are sort of persistent as a school. They're quite stable because we'll explore it in more detail soon. But one factor was that they were also a closed-off, self-sufficient community. The overcrowded attention space begins to be whittled down, right, after following the generations of Arcesilaus and Chrysippus. After the explosive outgrowth of the schools, three major factions still remain. The Platonic Academy, now in its skeptical phase. This is very strange, but we'll explore why in detail soon. Led by Arcesilaus and then by Carneades. The Stoics, as led by Chrysippus, and the Epicurean Brotherhood, which Epicurus has secured its identity for by absorbing and deftly synthesizing the various ideas of atomism, hedonism, materialism, all left behind by now extinct schools. Imposing the networks of the schools onto the networks of the philosophers once more, we can see that the general pattern in the two layers reinforcing one another. After the few generations of heightened competition, the overcrowding gives way to extinction and amalgamation, as most factions are whittled away. Additionally, gradual Hellenization or Romanization of Greece resulted in the shifting of the material base. A third turning point for the doctrines of the Greek philosophers was around 100 BC to 50 BC, following the conquest of Athens by the Romans, during which formal schools were replaced by personal followings of philosophers. You can see the effect this had on the schools in the diagram. Collins' point, which we encounter time and again, is that the material base determines the conditions of intellectual change without the latter reducing to the former. Right? It's not a reductionist thesis that says the ideal realm doesn't really matter in terms of its causal effects. It's all determined by the material anyway. That's not Collins' point. It's that the ideal structures have their own world, own reality, and there really is a lot of difference being made by the ideas, and they do have an effect on the physical material realm, but the conditions for which these ideas can come into existence at all in the first place are primarily determined by the material, right? So internalizing this model is essential to understanding Collins' theory of interaction ritual chains. I really want you to focus in on this whenever you're thinking about the networks that we're going to be exploring. Okay? So I'm going to quote Collins, quote, organizational turning points are intellectual turning points as well. Long-lasting schools, such as the Academy and the Perpatos, shifted their doctrines each time in response to realignments of the entire field, end quote. Depending on the conditions of the intellectual field, different kinds of creativity become dominant as competitive strategies. According to Collins, there are two kinds of creativity in philosophy, existing along a spectrum rather than as pure forms. They are the fractionalizing and the synthesizing kinds. Fractionalizers maximize their distinctiveness through often extremist polemics, such as in the poetic visions of Heraclitus and Parmenides. They attach to their opponents only in negative ways, even when they are in fact positively influenced. The synthesizers, on the other hand, seek to form alliances, particularly among weakening positions. They work to reduce the overload of factions in crowded periods. They search for a vision of an overarching truth, such as in the skillful interweaving of positions into a moderate system in the philosophy of Aristotle. The first 6 to 8 generations of Greek philosophers were solely fractionalizing. It was structurally impossible to reach consensus within the context of the newly opened up and empty field. As we saw, the schools proliferated wildly and weakened thereafter. Now finally we arrive at Plato and Aristotle, whom we consider to be the main characters of ancient Greek philosophy, right? Although you'll find it peculiar that I haven't focused on these two throughout the talk. I'll explain why, but I think you'll be able to figure out from our networked focused approach as to why I have done that. Now, compare Plato's doctrines against the early, purely fractionalizing philosophers of the pre-Socratic period. The main concern of the pre-Socratics, as we saw in their invention of philosophy, was the evolution away from the mythopoeic mode of thought. They were still using the tools of mythology in order to overcome mythology, and they relied on poetry as a medium to do so as well. Many of Socrates' contemporaries are poets, as is Plato in his early years. However, by Plato's time, the process of abstracting away the gods has progressed so far that Plato can now call to outright ban poets from his ideal society. The overthrow of mythology and the gods is apparently complete. As we shall see, this is hardly the case. Quote from Amanda Collins: "We take it for granted that Plato was Platonic, just as we take it as part of his essential qualities that he was Socrates' star pupil. But this view is the result of many generations of filtering." End quote. So, whereas we think of Plato as, and perhaps Aristotle as well, as standalone geniuses, for whose genius works that we remember them by, Collins' point is that actually it was their significance within the broader network, as well as their connections with the other philosophers and the influences and the import of their philosophies for the subsequent generations of philosophers that really made them the philosophers that remember them as. According to Collins, Plato's uniqueness is not due to his genius, although the distinction between Socrates and Plato owes primarily to the latter's epistemological acuity. His rival epistemologists in the Megarian school and the Elean school both produced their own works of genius. Neither was Plato the only one to build on Pythagoras' mathematical philosophy. Although his academy was ultimately to colonize the mathematical niche left behind by the Pythagoreans. And yet, it is only Plato whose texts survive out of this lot. In the diagram, compare Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle against Euclides of Megara, the founder of the Megarian school, and Phaedo, the founder of the Elean school. What should jump out at you is the sheer quantity of connections for Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and the relative lack of connections for Euclides and Phaedo. Now, most importantly, Plato is connected to Aristotle by way of being his master, and thus he was carried by Aristotle and the Aristotelian philosophy as a foil against Aristotelian philosophy. Right, this secured Platonism in its pure form as an anchor when the orthodoxy of the academy deviated far from the one given by Plato, such as when it ventured into a place for star worship, or, worse, from Plato's perspective, skepticism. And even when the active home base for Platonists was ultimately lost. It was competition, not reverence, which ultimately secured Plato his eminence. Now, why was Aristotle so successful? The great problem of the day for the philosophers of Aristotle's generation is how to manage the seemingly endless number of philosophies. Other schools are, of course, also aware of the fact that their field is overcrowded. But Aristotle stands out by his explicit focus on solving this problem of intellectual overcrowding and of itself, through ordering and synthesizing them within a unified system. The skeptics, such as Pero, instead take the overwhelming variety of positions as a proof of relativism. The paradoxers lean into the apparent intractability of it all, maximizing the catchiness of their ideas. The lifestyle philosophers and the secretive brotherhoods both attempt to stake out literal territories to a more limited extent, secured through the headcount of those who embody their ethical principles. Aristotle discourses with each of these schools of thought with a fair and sympathetic tone, even though many of them are viciously antagonistic towards him. He constructs a methodology focused on systematizing and reconciling to the best extent possible the variety of actual and possible positions in many fields, allowing him to rise above them at a higher level of abstraction. This conceptual armory is to be put to good use by the philosophers far beyond Aristotle's own time throughout history, ensuring him his eminence. Collins' point with Aristotle here is first and foremost that philosophy done in the synthesizing mode at a time which calls for a solution for overcrowding is bound to succeed, if only with its full payoff delayed by generations. I would add the observation that the most natural reaction against overcrowding from the fractionalizing perspective is to dismiss other schools of thought as not worth being aware of. Indeed, Seneca the Stoic characterizes the paradoxes of Eubulides, who bitterly opposed Aristotle, as harmless not to know and useless to know well. This negative gambit goes hand in hand with the positive gambit of the fractionalizing mode, namely staking out a position and radicalizing it, distinguishing oneself from both one's peers and predecessors. Around 300 BC, most of the older schools have died out. Both the Academy and the Peripatetics survive, but have each shifted their positions. The Peripatetics turn to materialism and empirical science. The Academy turns to skepticism, a shocking turn of events given Plato's own opposition to skepticism. Two new schools emerge, the Stoics and the Epicureans. The Epicureans take the atomism of the Cyrenaics and the hedonism of the Abderans, taking on Aristotle's synthesizing strategy to formulate a grand system of materialist, but certainly not Aristotelian, theology, physics, psychology, epistemology, and ethics. They take over the space left by the lifestyle movements, now made untenable by the Macedonian conquest of the 330s, which destroy the democracies and the public debates that accompanied them. The reason that their lifestyle movements were made untenable is fascinating to consider. Because the lifestyle philosophers survived by an ostentatious display of contempt for the conventional values of Greek life and its intellectual mainstream, the very displacement of its critique meant the end of these purely critical movements. Some of their ideas, though, were absorbed by the Stoics. The early Stoics thrived on the controversy that this generated. Their communities were a brotherhood of men, replacing the family, who shared women in common. They also advocated for incest. This is a very different picture, obviously, from the contemporary image of the Stoics that we have, who give respectable, almost businessy self-development types of advice for the middle class, aspiring hustler types of readers, right? But the Stoics abandoned this cynic extremism within a generation, and they staked out a new niche, more recognizable to us as a respectable form of education, advocating the fulfillment of social duties. During this period, the Aristotelians are reacting to the ascendancy of the two new schools. Okay, the Epicureans with the materialism occupying the far left, and the Stoics occupying the center here with the respectable form of education that they're selling to the more mainstream audiences, the better paying mainstream audiences. Right. Their eclecticism really appeals to the secular upper classes, and that's the niche that they've carved out for themselves. The Aristotelians are also reacting to the academics, who by now have begun to repudiate Plato's idealist theory of the forms and his mathematicism, in favor of skepticism. Right, so the Stoics in particular are a major influence on all the other schools during this period, having formulated a powerful combination of a materialist worldview on the one hand, and the theory of an immortal soul on the other hand, which permeates and governs all things. Right, they're harkening back to the debates of the pre-Socratics here. That's so interesting. They're harkening back to the old debates, but they're giving it a new spin with more advanced forms of philosophy. The Cynics, the Skeptics, and the Cyrenaics occupy a position to the left of center, principally a negative position existing as a plague on all houses stance. And to the far right are the Megarians, advocating an extreme anti-pluralism, even attacking Platonic forms as not being monist enough, which gives you a pretty reasonable idea of just how extreme the Megarians were when they're attacking the Platonic theory of the forms, which all must conform to the criterion of perfection given by the chief good, and it forms a sort of a unifying, monisticizing influence on the metaphysics of the world. So you see, the Platonists are moderate compared to the Megarians. That shows how extreme the Megarians are. And the Aristotelians, having already been moving towards materialism, now wholeheartedly abandon Aristotle's cautious compromise with Platonic idealism, committing themselves to materialism and empiricism. The Aristotelians attack the concept of the immortal soul given by the Stoics. Okay, the Aristotelians reduce the soul to a physical substance that they call the pneuma, or breath. This is a direct attack on the Stoics. This is a direct but theoretical, technical attack on the Stoics. The Cynics, Skeptics, and the Cyrenaics die out, but their moral force is appropriated by the Epicureans. The Platonists shift further right, appropriating the Megarian skepticism in order to attack the Stoics also on technical grounds. So you see that the Stoics are such a powerful influence that the other schools are having to move away from the niche that they've stacked out, and also at the same time engage in primarily theoretical attacks rather than attacks in the form of staking out niches that overlap with their territory in the network. So their attacks on the Stoics are at the ideal level. All of this really makes it clear just how powerful of a presence that the Stoics were, and they had an influence and a presence both in philosophy and religion. The Platonists also traditionally occupied a religious niche, with Plato himself advocating for celestial worship, such as in his Laws, with the sun as the object of a compulsory state cult. It's very interesting, right? We don't hear a lot about Plato's religious side, but it really shows through when you try to read his works more closely. Some of the ideas that stand out as preposterous, even the myth of the metals, in which he suggests inventing a new myth to convince all of the people in his ideal republic to believe, wherein each person is born with a different metal infused into their soul, with the philosopher king being born with a gold infused soul, the guardians being born with the silver infused soul, and so on. It makes sense when you consider it in this light. And it wasn't just Plato, it wasn't just the Megarians, it wasn't just the Stoics or the Pythagoreans. All of the Greeks, including the Greek philosophers, whom we often are tempted, perhaps, to consider as paragons of rationality, were religious. It was just a normal way to think. The religious territory of the Platonists was seriously threatened by the Stoics. The Platonists' religion was esoteric, just like the Pythagoreans. It was practiced in secret by initiates who were initiated into religion, often through, and this is just religion in general in ancient Greece, especially in the secret sects, secret cults. The practitioners were initiated into the cults through spiritual experiences, often induced through the imbibing of hallucinogenic substances. The most fascinating example of this is the Dionysian cult, in which people, because Dionysus was the god of drunkenness and entrancement, the participants in the rituals would imbibe hallucinogenics and then dress up as animals, roam the wilderness, and basically tear up and kill anything they saw, including especially animals, but also sometimes people. And even more interestingly, the cult members of the Dionysian cult tended to be female, which was a big topic of debate and excitement for the ancient Greeks. It was quite thrilling for them to talk about. So anyway, back to Plato and his religion, the Platonists and their religions. So, whereas the Platonists and their religions was esoteric, the Stoic religion was not esoteric. It was mainstream. It was practiced in public. It could be practiced in the open. And on top of that, the mainstream public nature already made them much more successful than the esoterics, but on top of that, they had a doctrine that said temples in the physical, made of marble sense, are superfluous because the mind itself is a temple, and so you can worship anywhere you go without an actual physical temple in the outside being present. That was very popular with the mainstream practitioners because it meant that on the one hand you could practice your religion anywhere, including when you're participating in ceremonies in general, but on the other hand it nonetheless left open the room for practicing religion in a conventional way. Here we see the four surviving schools of Greek philosophy. From the left to right, the Aristotelian Peripatos, the Platonic Academy, and the Stoics, and the Epicureans. The Platonists and the Stoics in particular maintain a symbiotic relationship for some time, even though they're competing, right? According to Collins, this is a form of symbiosis because innovation and persistence of the networks is facilitated by competition. However, between 100 BC and 50 BC, especially with the sacking of Athens by the Romans in 86 BC, the Greek intellectuals lose their material base as they know it. For a mood of the period, consider some of the famous known philosophers appearing in the diagram. Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, Scipio, Augustus Caesar. Note their connections with various Stoic, Aristotelian, Epicurean, and Platonist philosophers of the period. Here, we see the intellectual movements of the time, with the Platonists and Neo-Pythagoreans on the left, Stoics in the center, and the medical school on the right. For a more concrete sense of the times, consider Philo of Larissa, here shown on the top left, succeeding Clitomachus as the head of the academy. This is during the formation of Christianity, and Philo is a contemporary of Jesus and St. Paul, though he had no knowledge of the Christian movement, so his works exclusively concern the Old Testament when it does concern the Christian canon, right? So Philo softens the stance of the academy from what was full-blown skepticism to mere fallibilism. The doctrine emphasizing the difficulty of knowledge, but retaining the goal of knowledge per se. This is a sign of the times. Why? Because it's a concession to lay audiences who are hostile to pure skepticism in the fashion of Pyrrho, who couldn't even decide whether to go down the left side or the right side when he's walking down the road. Okay, so acting as a meta school above the clash of the competing positions is only respectable within a thriving, busy intellectual community. It's now in collapse. Skepticism instead permeates throughout intellectual life generally, rising whenever there is a dense enough intellectual network to react against, such as during 150 C to 200 C. It also becomes taken up by the medical school, who provides them a material base. Philo also reconciles rhetoric and philosophy, ending a long-standing rivalry exemplified by Plato's opposition of the Sophists. This is a really big deal because this was one of the outstanding rivalries of Plato's period. Okay, this was one of the driving motive factors in Plato's philosophy. During this period, in the age of the second sophistic, intellectuals primarily make their living by showcasing the power of rhetorical exposition, or showing off what clever, flowery speeches they can give as entertainment for lay public audiences. This even included the medical professionals such as Galen, who did not primarily make a living through his medical practice, but instead also gave talks both on philosophy and medicine. After its formation around the year 30 in Palestine, Christianity spread through Syria, Asia Minor, and the Eastern Mediterranean over the next 2 generations. Christianity had 2 rivals, the Gnostics and the Hellenistic philosophers. The Gnostics were largely esoteric secret societies. The Hellenistic philosophers did not have a formal organization until they were later pushed to do so by the threat of a formalized Christian church. The Christians were organized in such a way as to consolidate the church hierarchy. Doctrines which opposed a centralized church hierarchy and its right to appoint priests was opposed as heresy. Whichever theological faction contributed to the permanence-enhancing organizational structures emerged as the victors in the intellectual competition. Through such a process of internal consolidation and external competition against the other mass recruiting religions, training for Christian priests had become formalized by the year 200. This led to the rise of Christian intellectuals who could stake out their own distinctive positions within the intellectual field at large, and formally organized pagan philosophers emerged in opposition. Around the year 250, the Christian church consolidated its power. At the same time, a pagan united front emerged around Plotinus' Neoplatonism. Until around the year 200, intellectuals did not concern themselves very much with religion. Christianity was still not recognized as a threat. The would-be pagan philosophers did not bother to defend the traditional polytheism associated with them. The Gnostics and the occultists were looked down upon by intellectuals. During Christianity's tumultuous rise to increasing political power, Plotinus developed a system of philosophy founded on Platonism, which synthesized and raised the level of Christianity's rivals. Neoplatonism was a synthesizing philosophy, both in its content and its methodology. Whereas Plato begins his inquiry from the bottom up, preoccupied as he was with his fight against the relativists and the paradoxes, Plotinus begins from the top down with transcendence as a central idea. Okay, so he's taking over from Plato. Plato develops the transcendental theory of the forms as a sort of consequence, or not quite an afterthought, but the explanatory mechanism necessary for the bottom-up points that he's making. And he doesn't go into as much detail about the nature of the forms. It's unfortunately left to our imagination by and large exactly what the nature of the forms, especially the chief good, is. And he is supposed to have explained much of this in the lost text that he promised that he explains all of this in, called the Philosopher, but we haven't discovered it yet. Okay, so Plotinus begins from the top down, right? The new focus reflects the need for synthesis in the eclectic, diverse, overcrowded field. By the time of Plotinus, the Stoics are gone. So are the Epicureans, the Neo-Pythagoreans, the Cynics, the Aristotelian scientists, even the rhetors of the second sophistic. Plotinus forges a united front out of the survivors, combining them with what can be salvaged as intellectual from the religious and occult movements of his time. He also appropriates the cultural capital of the collapsed schools, first purging them of their materialism. The result is a theory of pure transcendence, around which all could unite, what was now identifiable as pagan philosophy. The generations following Plotinus intensified the battle against Christianity. His student Porphyry edited his manuscripts, which were originally written in illegible handwriting and full of errors because Plotinus despised the editing process, and his eyesight was failing anyway. The resulting collection of essays, the Enneads, was massively influential on subsequent Christian and Muslim philosophers such as Augustine. Porphyry further sharpened the synthesis of his master, adding to it Stoic logic and Aristotelian categories. Meanwhile, Christianity was triumphing politically. Neoplatonism became the center of not only philosophical opposition, but of political opposition against Christianity as well, including a campaign to restore the traditional cults. As the movement went underground in this struggle, the philosophical purity of Plotinus' theory became diluted. Magic was introduced. Iamblichus, Porphyry's student, displaced philosophy with theurgy, the use of magic to become a god. Neoplatonists of this era onwards were magicians, with powers of mind-reading, raising the dead, and clairvoyance, and working magic spells generally. Iamblichus broadened the coalition to even include Gnosticism, which was anathema to Plotinus precisely due to Gnostic belief in magic. The use of magic by the Neoplatonists did allow them some political success. A circle of Iamblichus followers, with displays of phantom-calling magic, briefly convinced the young Emperor Julian to overthrow Christianity as the official state religion. So it did work just for a little bit. The last great pagan philosopher was Proclus. He was devoutly religious in a rather unspecific way. He apparently believed in anything but Christianity. He observed all the holy days and rituals of both the Greek and the Egyptian calendars, the mysteries of the Chaldean to the Orphic. He of course also practiced theurgy, which he had learned from a daughter of the famous philosopher and historian Plutarch. Through his extreme syncretism, Proclus attempted to preserve all pagan learning without much discrimination. Proclus produced commentaries on both Plato and Euclid, in which he outlined his own theory of Neoplatonism. For all the jarring new additions made in the heat of battle, the Neoplatonists of the period considered themselves to be merely transmitting the original teachings of Plato, and not innovating. Proclus also believed as much. If the silliness of the magical beliefs makes it challenging to believe that he was a great philosopher in his own right, consider his systematic works, in which he presents a series of propositions, each followed by a proof. Here shown on the right in his Elements of Theology. It's a surprisingly modern structure, right? He names the propositions in numbers, proposition 1, proposition 2, so on. Each of the propositions are first given, say, all multitude participates in a certain respect of the one, and then he tries to give a proof of that proposition, and then he moves on to the next proposition, and so on. At the same time as competing with the pagans externally, the victorious Christians were internally split. This is natural for a victorious intellectual movement. While weak movements die out, the strong movements subdivide. The subdividing Christian philosophers appropriated cultural capital from the collapsing positions, starting with the Middle Platonists and the Neoplatonists, as well once the latter's political power dissipated entirely. The greatest intellectual beneficiaries here were the Christian philosophers most closely involved in the networks connected to the pagan philosophers. Why? Because they were able to appropriate the most useful cultural capital, thanks to the accumulated sophistication of the pagans. Augustine is a great example. He worked to win over his own class, the sophisticated Roman aristocrats. They considered Neoplatonism and the rest of pagan philosophical tradition as superior to Christianity. As part of his effort, Augustine developed a sophisticated proof of the existence of God, starting with the certainty of self-knowledge, and then moving into an internal epistemic sense by which exterior senses are judged, and then finally to the implication that a standard by which reason itself is judged must exist. Here you recognize this format. If you're familiar at all with modern philosophy, he's developing a cogito ergo sum argument. It anticipates both Descartes and St. Anselm, surprisingly ahead of his time. He subsequently reached the height of his philosophical sophistication, as though that wasn't enough, when he wrote The City of God for a sophisticated pagan audience, defending Christianity against the accusation that its adoption as the state religion was what had caused the sack of Rome by the Visigoths as divine punishment. In the book, Augustine presents a picture of the history of the world as a war between God and the devil, in which the governments of the world are directly involved as participants in that war. The City of God is seminal in Western thought, and much of its success is owed to Augustine's encyclopedic knowledge of pagan cultural capital. I want to end this talk with a practical question. Do we find ourselves in a period of intellectual overcrowding? What can we do about it? Is the answer always to synthesize, or is it to seek out less crowded contexts in which we can fractionalize? Let me know what you think.